Well, this week's Inside the Lords is full of intrigue. The big story of the week, politically, and you could say the only story in town, except there's now another story in town, is the Windsor deal. I think that the atmosphere in Parliament would indicate to you a number of problems with this deal. First of all, that nobody in Parliament knew what was in it before the press releases, and the fact that we had Ursula von der Leyen, of all people, there to announce it with Rishi Sunak, and the fact that she and the EU had sight of it before the UK Parliament did is an indication of some of the problems with that deal. Just the way that it has effectively been a sewn up deal. And I think that makes us all very nervous. You know, we are all conscious of the fact that there's now controversy about King Charles being involved in it, who organised that. It should tell you something, but certainly in the Lords, people are like, what do we think of this deal? And now we've only just seen it, and I've now got copies of the deal. But one thing that you might have noticed from my Inside the Lords over the time is that I've read the government statement on the deal, and honestly, it's genuinely impressive, apparently, what concessions have been made in terms of the trading relationships, or the removal of some of the most irritating things that were getting in the way of people just having normal relations between Britain and the 6 counties, in terms of anything from sending parcels to doing business. Lots of it's been removed. A lot of the regulations that have been thwarting people having those kind of normal relationships have been taken away, and that's enough to make anybody a bit excited in terms of an everyday moment. But when you read that document, and I thought Rishi presented it brilliantly in Parliament, it has to be said, and certainly in the House of Lords yesterday, Nick Chu, who's a real proper good Brexiteer, and he's in charge of the House of Lords, and he did the presentation on it. God, I'd buy it, right? I think this is great. What's interesting, though, is that you will know that that is not the legal text, and I've learnt nothing else by being a legislator, is that it doesn't matter what's in the press release or the write-up of the law. It's what the law says. So you have to read the legal document, which is much harder because it's all in legalese. But there isn't a UK legal text yet, so we have to read the EU's legal text, which they've now made available. And then you start to think, there appears to be a huge gap between what they're saying and the actual details in this legal text. And that's before you get to the points of principle. And the points of principle are still that the European Court of Justice has the final arbitration and say over what will happen in a part of the United Kingdom, and that this idea, 97% of the regulations go, only 3% remain. Well, then you go, well, why 3%, right? And people have made this point, and it's very important. You should be able to do a business deal with Belfast as easily as you can do a business deal with Glasgow, if you're going to be serious about what is the United Kingdom.
I mean, that is really good.
Now, of course, there's always a controversy. There has been a long history of controversy about whether the 6 counties of Northern Ireland should be part of the United Kingdom. That is a controversy, and that border has historically created problems. And that might well be something which the people of Ireland will address, or should address, or needs to be thought about. But in relation to Brexit and the EU, it should not be up to the European Union to be able to override what is the Union of the United Kingdom. That is not their business, right? They can't be the ones that can just sweep away that union. That has to be something that's decided democratically. And so I'm afraid that on what I've seen on those points of principle, the kind of, it's not very much interference is not sufficient to make me feel better. And then the other thing we have to bear in mind is that it sets a precedent, because the precedent is that the deal has been opened, renegotiated, and now, yes, that's, the EU are delighted with themselves. And when I listened to in the Lords yesterday in the debate, which sadly I couldn't get into, it's too much competition for a 40-minute discussion, I'm afraid that the opposition benches were crowing over, we always knew the protocol was terrible, which is not true, because they've been defending the protocol for a long time. But, and this was always a terrible deal, and we should never have left the EU, effectively. We know we've left, but it was a mistake. when I hear those opposition benches and they're likely to be the government in a couple of years, why can't they just reopen the settlement with the EU? Why can't they say, well, we found another thing that we don't like, and then reopen the settlement and so on? I think it bodes badly. And the final thing is that when yesterday Lord True, and it had happened in the Commons as well, announced that the Northern Irish Protocol Bill was being abolished, then there was cheers from opposition benches. And I was furious, because I thought, surely what we have to do is, or the government, what should be doing is waiting to see what the response of Parliament and the British public are to this deal that they say we've all got time to think about and read carefully before they get rid of the bill which was going to resolve the problems of the protocol. I also feel, as usual, that as parliamentarians, if I can say that now, we'd been marched up the hill and back again. I went out and I batted for the government in terms of defending that Northern Irish Protocol Bill, very unpopular bill that it was. Prior to that, I'd done the same with the Internal Markets Bill, both of which were designed to ensure that the ECJ would not be able to thwart that sovereignty question and would resolve some of the problems of the protocol. And guess what? The Tories just tear it up because they say, oh no, it's all right. But it means it's a fait accompli. It doesn't matter whether the DUP say yay or nay, they're going to do this anyway. So that's not a happy story, but been quite a dominant part of life in the Lords this week. But anyway, then excitement, Isabel Oakeshott has revealed all those WhatsApp messages from Matt Hancock. Now, you know, all I'm saying is don't necessarily get Isabel Oakeshott to co-write your book. Don't handle your WhatsApp messages. I think, however, what her justification for it in today's Telegraph is a reasonably honourable one, which is, you know, the inquiry into the pandemic period. To say that it's being slow and sludgy and seems to be excluding a whole range of questions needs to happen much more urgently, much more quickly, and ask every question. And the fact that this is now in the public domain, these WhatsApp messages, is going to help us shine a light on that period. And we are, and you'll see it on this Substack, we did the lockdown inquiry very early on in the lockdown, and we made some little films of people, what it was like living in the lockdown, and I think you should have a look at them. And we made a point then that this isn't something we should forget. None of us want to be dominated by lockdown. I don't want to go on and on about that period, but things happened in terms of the overriding of every civil liberty in this country, every freedom. We were locked in our homes, and we shouldn't forget. So lest we forget, these WhatsApp messages, and indeed the spirit of our own lockdown inquiry at the time, I think is something that we should actually use to hold politicians to account. This morning, Lord Bethell, he was the kind of mini-me Matt Hancock in the House of Lords, the health minister in the House of Lords when I first arrived, was trying to justify Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages and talk about, you know, privacy and why they shouldn't have been revealed and how he's only trying to do his job and what a wonderful man he was. I'd just like to point out that he is also the minister who added me to, when I was in the Lords for very long, added me to a list on Twitter of COVID deniers because I asked a few questions about lockdown and care homes. Such is their technological genius that between them, Bethell managed to let me see that he'd done that by accident, and therefore I chastised him for him, asked him to remove me from that list. Hancock's technological genius was to hand them over to Isabel Oakeshott. I mean, how mad is that? I mean, you know, who needs an online safety bill in which they say that they're going to attack our right to privacy on WhatsApp when you've got idiots handing them over? I mean, Bethell removed his. He destroyed all his WhatsApp messages. He said his phone was over capacity. But that's not going to be very good for the inquiry, is it? So that'll just show you the murky mess. I do think, though, that it is important that there's too many people who refuse to acknowledge that at the height of the lockdown and throughout that period that they were enthusiastic cheerers on of government policy. This was across all parties, and so it's not that I want to go at Matt Hancock in particular, but to just note that I suppose that they're all culpable. I mean, if I can blame everyone, but there has to be a holding to account for these things. And so my final thoughts are that when I go back, I'm going over to the Lords now, and there's an important vote tonight on journalistic freedom, which I will be voting for journalistic freedom against some typically illiberal part of the national security bill that the government have brought in. I do think that it will be interesting walking around. I had a funny experience yesterday of Baroness Hoey, Kate Hoey, you know, saying to a minister, "My brother can't get those seeds. You know, you can't." And I thought, boys, God, we're reduced to talking about seeds. But she was making the point, an important point, which is that we had just heard that everybody would now be able to import or seeds easily with no problems because of this new bill. And she was making the point that she'd found out that that was a bit of a white lie, because actually it's only official organisations like that would be able to do that. Individual farmers will still have to pay a lot. That the red lane and the green lane, as she pointed out, not like when you're going on holiday and you go in the red lane and the green lane. The green lane has still got 30 pages to fill in. She pointed out as well that or somebody else pointed out from the DUP, that when they say they're getting rid of 1,700 pages of legislation from the EU, that sounds great until you remember how long legislation is everywhere, right? And then you think, why don't it say how many bills, how many laws, how many regulations? Why pages? That could be one regulation because they're all so long. All I'm saying is, when I go over, although getting caught up in the detail of this might be like almost gossipy the way you'll go through the WhatsApp messages from Hancock, the bigger picture is still that why is it that the government are not being straight on what this Windsor Agreement really is? Why do they have to tell those white lies? And why do we have to have somebody leaking a WhatsApp set of messages for us to find out exactly what happened in the lockdown period when the civil liberties of every citizen in this country were compromised? We shouldn't need to have to go through the detail like that. I don't want to be a technocrat. I don't want to be a gossip where I'm just reading it all, picking up bits of information from corridors in the House of Lords. This should be in the public domain, all of it, and freely and widely discussed. And so, whilst I feel a Brexit sellout is happening, I also feel that because the public are aware that the wool has been pulled over their eyes, they're going to take matters into their own hands, take back control, if you want, of the narrative, and at least not believe what they're told and start reading reading their stuff for themselves and making their own minds up, which is what I'd urge you to do. I'm not saying be opposed to this deal. Make your own mind up, but read everything and don't believe anything that anyone tells you. Question everything, my view. And I'll see you next week.